So here we go. Jerry, so glad to have you here today. You're here now for West Urb. That's your newest role, but you had other roles before, including being the head of sustainability for the city of Denver. And you really know urban sustainability and urban planning and climate planning, climate action planning inside out. You've worked in other places before being in Denver, but I guess after so many years in Colorado, one can say you're now a local in a way, or you've settled in. And I'm so glad that that I met you at some point, and also that we stayed in touch over the years and been doing things on and off. So thank you so much for joining us here, sharing a little bit. I'm actually personally interested in the topic because, well, I also work in the sustainability profession, and I'm very curious too, what will happen. You know, like most people here in the room know that my past was mostly doing a lot of travel with a lot of people, in-person meetings and all this. And this is so changed now. So this is really interesting, very timely to discuss this. And of course, also everybody else is welcome to ask questions later on. And I hope we find enough time to have a little bit of Q&A at the end. Jerry, thank you so much for joining us. And yes, you can take over now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Max, and good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Jerry Tinianow. Yes, I have known Max for several years now. We met through the Berlin Ecologic Institute, which I became engaged with after I became Denver's Chief Sustainability Officer in 2012. They are an incredibly impressive organization. They are really the leading sustainability organization or think tank in Europe, on a par with, let's say, the Rocky Mountain Institute in the United States. Through them, I met Max, and he founded the US office of the Berlin Ecologic Institute. And I know Max is also a very modest person, so he may not have shared with you the recent news that he has been appointed to the working group of the US Green Building Council on Lead for Cities and Communities. I've been serving on that for 2 years, and we had an opportunity to add some new members this year, and I made a push for Max. It took a while for all of the candidates, several months actually, but Max was recently admitted, and Max, we're really happy to have you as a member of that of the working group as we continue to set the template for sustainable communities around the world. I also see my friend Martin Volker on the call. He is one of the sustainability leaders here in the Denver area, and he and I have worked together on a number of projects. So my presentation today is in 4 parts. First, I want to tell you a little bit about myself, because people always ask, how did I get to the point where I'm doing what I'm doing? And I know that those of you in Pocosito are younger sustainability professionals who are thinking about your own careers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own path, although I have to warn you, do not do what I did, because my path is kind of interesting, but it's not really a path that's available today. I mention it only so that you understand my credentials for being able to talk about the other issues that we'll be discussing today. After I give you an overview of my own career, there will be 3 additional parts where I'll be talking about the mega trends, or the big trends in sustainability today. The first trend we want to look at is climate change. Climate change in recent years has become the vocabulary of sustainability. In the minds of some people, it's the same thing. The two are the same, but they're really not. And because they're not, because there's more to sustainability than just climate change, the next part of the presentation will be on the trends in the larger world of sustainability. And then finally, I want to come back to the area that may be of greatest interest to you, which is trends in the profession, trends in the sustainability profession. And I put that last, so you have to pay attention until the very end to get to the good stuff, right? And after each, Max mentioned questions at the end, but after each section, I'll pause for a moment. We can take some questions about that section. before moving on. And I think, Max, we want to end at the end of the hour, correct? Great. Okay, good. Well, nice to meet all of you. I'm currently in the first year, actually just completed the first year of my private consultancy, which is a company called Western Urban Sustainability Advisors. And it's based on the work that I've been doing in what we call sustainability for the last 45 years. I started in this area when I was in college in Washington, D.C., George Washington University. I chose my college based on one criterion alone, only one, and that is which college in the United States was closest to Capitol Hill. Because I wanted to work on Capitol Hill during college, and sure enough, that worked out. I got a job with a young freshman congressman from Montana named Max Baucus, and I was on his staff from the beginning. He later became the senator from Montana and then eventually the U.S. ambassador to China. And he assigned me to work in the area of what was then called alternative energy, which I kind of laugh about now, because now we would like, oil and gas and coal to become the alternative energy, and wind and solar and geothermal and so forth to be the main sources of energy. But back then it was all very new. And so he assigned me to work on alternative energy, agriculture, food systems, forestry, natural resources, and the regional economy of Western Montana. So he introduced me to it, and then I just stuck with it. I went on to law school. I stayed in Washington. I clerked for what was then called the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, which is now called Earth Justice, the legal arm of the Sierra Club. Then I went back home to Cleveland, Ohio, and I volunteered with the Sierra Club while carrying on a full-time practice of law. I was a trial attorney for over 20 years, for 22 years. And during that time, I did this sustainability work as a volunteer, mainly through the Sierra Club, where I worked my way up from local group chairman up to state chairman and then regional vice president, and then eventually national vice president. I was actually overseeing the network of regional conservation committees, volunteer work in the United States and Canada in my spare time while I was carrying on a full-time practice as an attorney. You're already beginning to see why I said don't do what I do, because this isn't the path that most people follow. And I, at some point, decided that I wanted to do this kind of work full time. I enjoyed being a trial attorney, but it wasn't enough for me. And so from the time I decided that until the time I actually found that job where I could do this full time was 10 years. 10 years. Again, don't do what I did. The reason it was 10 years was because I wanted to stay. It was by that time I had been transferred to Columbus, Ohio, and I wanted to stay there rather than move somewhere else because my kids were in school and I didn't want to disrupt their lives. And at that time, we're going to come back to this, but at that time, there weren't a lot of jobs in Columbus, Ohio in this area. But finally, after 10 years, I had the opportunity to become the state director for the National Audubon Society in Ohio, in Columbus, and I did that job for 6 years. And in fact, we're joined on this call, I can see, by Michael Bongiorno, who was the architect I worked with while I was the state director at Audubon to develop the nation's most urban nature education center, the Grange Insurance Audubon Center, which is just a mile south of downtown Columbus. We built it on a brownfield, a former brownfield. Michael was the project architect, the award-winning project architect. He won the AIA award both as designed and also as built. So Michael, I'm glad you're able to join us today. So I did that work with Audubon, nature, habitat, things like that for 6 years. Then I transitioned over to the Center for Energy and Environment at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, which is, as the name suggests, a regional planning entity. And I did the directorship of the Center for Energy and Environment there for 3 years. And then I had this odd opportunity to come to Denver to be the city's first chief sustainability officer. And I was very much a dark horse candidate for that job, was not even interviewed during the first set of interviews, but the mayor didn't like any of the first few candidates, did another set of interviews, and brought me in 2012. And I did the job from 2012 to 2019, which was the end of our mayor's second term. I told him as he went into his second term, that I would only stay through the second term because we have term limits in Denver, and I didn't want to be serving in a lame duck administration. So I did that job for 7 years, started with a program that the mayor himself said was just a marketing office, and turned it into what I think was one of the leading urban sustainability programs in the United States. In my final year, we won LEED Platinum certification for Denver under the Lead for Cities and Communities program. We also made the A list of CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. We were in those top 7% of cities worldwide that report through CDP on their carbon emissions and their climate change activities, and we made the A list. We also were featured in the 10th anniversary issue of the Solutions Journal, which is an academic journal on the kind of the success stories in sustainability, and they devoted their entire 10th anniversary issue in 2019 to Denver and Denver sustainability work. So I ended on a high note, started this practice of advising other cities and local governments on how to do sustainability, and ran smack into COVID. This was not the year to start a new business. But fortunately, because of all my work before, I'm financially independent. Plus, it hasn't been a problem. I've been able to continue on, and things are starting to warm up again. So as you can see, I've had 3 different careers. I've been a trial attorney. I've been a wildlife and animal conservation person, and I've been an urban sustainability professional. So don't do what I did, because I have had no schooling in sustainability, no certification in sustainability. I am not LEED anything. If they had a certification for LEED wannabe, I would be a LEED wannabe. And although I have no certifications, working with Michael, we produced a LEED Gold Nature Education Center. Working, in my own job, I produced a LEED Platinum City, and now I'm working on the LEED, the group that's writing the next generation of LEED for Cities and Communities. But no certifications whatsoever. And that may not be the path that you're following, and that's fine. So let me pause there and see if anyone has any questions about my background. And then I see it looks like you're all muted, so you'll have to unmute. I'll give it a moment, and then if not, we'll move on to the second part of the presentation. Okay, I must have been stunning. So I'm going to share my screen here in just a moment. You'll see yourself first, but then I'll pull up another presentation. Okay, just give me a moment here. We'll maximize this. And I won't be able to see you anymore, but I will be able to hear you. So this is a play in 3 acts. Act 1, Megatrends Climate. Let me start by talking about what I'm seeing in the area of climate, which, as I mentioned, has become the vocabulary of sustainability. And the first thing we see is that no one is meeting their goals. 2018 was a huge year for municipal sustainability, because that's the year that the IPCC released its latest update. That's the year when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us that we were not on track to prevent 1.5% or 1.5 degrees Celsius or even 2 degrees Celsius global warming, that we had to do things much faster, that we could not be talking about 80 by 50. We could not be talking about an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We had to be talking about 0%. Zero emissions by 2050. We had to be at 45% reduction by 2030. And this is a kick in the gut for everyone. Denver had just come out with its 80 by 50 plan. And as I said, we were on the A list. We were one of the leaders. And the IPCC said, sorry, but that's not enough. And they said it to everyone. And so here we are now 2 years later, and they said, we have to be at 45% reduction by 2030 if we have any hope at all. And here we are, and we know that the world is not on track to meet the goals that they've set for 2030 or for 2050. And it's not just in climate change, it's in everything. Just 2 days ago, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity released their Outlook 5, their latest report. Keep in mind that the Covenant on Biological Diversity came out 10 years ago, and they had a 10-year strategic plan. So they issued their 10-year report 2 days ago, and they said, and I'm quoting, at the global level, none of the 20 targets have been fully achieved, and 6 of the targets have been partially achieved. So 6 partially achieved, 14 not even partially, 0 achieved. 34% of those goals are on track. 3% have been met, so it wasn't quite 0, it's 3%. 51%, they said, are in progress, but and not at a rate sufficient to achieve them by 2030, which was their target year. 11%, there was no progress, and 1% were going backwards. And it's not just the biological diversity goals. The SDGs, the UN Sustainability Development Goals, in their 2020 report, keep in mind those were adopted 2015, looking to 2030, so we're 5 years along. In their new report, which just came out, they said that we were not on track to meet their goals by 2030, any of their goals, not a single one. Euronews reported earlier this year that no member of the European Union was on track to meet these goals by 2030. And a few of them were making some progress, and we knew who was doing more and who was doing less, but no one was on track to meet those goals either. So this is what we're seeing worldwide right now, and it's of concern. And I want to tell you before I go to the rest of my presentation, some of what I say can seem to be a downer, but what you'll see is there's both downers and uppers. There's good news and bad news right now. And I want to get what I think is the worst news out of the way first, which is that no one currently is meeting their goals. Last year, Greta Thunberg was offered a climate change award, which she declined. And she said that the time for climate change awards was over, that no one had earned one, no one deserved one. And I agree with her. And yet we are still giving them out. There was, Greta was a very popular, high-profile figure last year. She's kind of receded into the background now. But when she said the time for climate change awards is over, I agree with her. However, we are still giving them out. Just this morning, I received a solicitation for nominations for the Energy and Environment Leadership 100 Awards that will be given out next year. The Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, which I've worked with a lot over the last few years, they are still giving out climate change awards. And when I go through the new climate change reports from cities, one of the things I find is all of them claim to be leaders. I wrote an article on LinkedIn a few weeks ago on how the latest generation of climate change reports, the post-IPCC city climate change plans, should be evaluated. And one of the things I've noticed is that everyone says they're a leader, but as I've been going through the new climate change awards, the new municipal climate change plans, many of these organizations are saying that they are not prepared to commit to do what needs to be done to stay on the track that the IPCC says we need to be on. I've said in the past that the two most important words in sustainability are and yet. Because so many times we've been to these conferences where we hear about these great projects that companies are doing, and we've seen the awards, we've read the articles, and yet, no one is meeting their goals. And so this is really a very critical time right now. 2030 is a big year. It's the end year for the Sustainable Development Goals. It's the big intermediate year for the IPCC, but we can't wait until 2028, to start worrying about whether we're going to meet those 2030 numbers. Really, the next 12 to 18 months are critical for this. And the third trend, which is related, is we may soon shift to focusing mostly, if not entirely, on climate change adaptation. Now you see I've got a white flag up here, a surrender flag, for this point, because doing so may look like a surrender. But I'm already hearing the earliest rumblings about, well, maybe we should really, we're just not going to make it. We really have to focus on adaptation. And adaptation, by the way, is fundamentally an equity issue, because that's where your commitment to do equity or not to do it is really going to come out. No one's really saying it loudly, but I think it's kind of inevitable we're going to hear that soon. The good news is, and Denver, during my term, Denver was the first city in the United States to come out with a comprehensive climate change adaptation plan. We weren't the first ones to come out with a plan that was called an adaptation plan, but when I looked at the other ones, they were just vulnerability assessments. They weren't actually plans. We were the first ones to have a plan. And one of the things we noticed in putting that plan together is that so much of what you do for adaptation can also relate to mitigation. So for example, if you're planting trees and vegetating the edges of your waterways, that also has a carbon sequestration effect. Or if you're planting trees to shade buildings against higher temperatures in the summer, you're also reducing their energy needs and helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I could go on and on. So although the shift to adaptation may look like a surrender, I honestly believe that if it's handled the right way, adaptation itself can become the new leading tool for mitigation, for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's important to remember that the goal is not to slow down the rate of emissions. The goal is to stop it and then start removing carbon from the atmosphere. That's the only way that we're going to get to where the IPCC says we need to be in 2030. And I was very encouraged yesterday in the town hall that the U.S. Green Building Council had for the Mountain States, that the president of USGBC announced that by 2025, his goal is that USGBC will have a new standard, LEED positive. So they already have LEED zero, and there's a lot of talk about net zero, but he says that's not enough. By 2025, halfway between now and 2030, he wants LEED to have a standard that's LEED positive. And some of the projects under LEED are already net positive. They are producing more energy than they consume. They are actually producing more clean water coming out than clean water going in, and so forth. That's the direction that we have to head, both in adaptation and also in climate change mitigation. And with that, let me stop on this mega trend and see if there's any questions. Remember, I can't see you, but I can hear you, so I'll pause for a moment.
Just one thing, Jerry, very, very interesting point. Yeah, I remember this from maybe 10 or 12 years ago, how there were a lot of people in the climate community who didn't want to talk about adaptation at all. And I think that's still a little bit the case, because they said, well, if we open up that discussion, we're going to reduce the pressure on mitigation efforts, and we're going to make it basically like an either or approach, and people will think, oh, we don't need to mitigate, we can just go into adaptation. And of course, in a bit of a worrying development, you could say they were in a way right, because that's where we're ending up now. But it's still interesting, that tension between these two communities. And I like it how you suggest to bring these together and how to overcome this dichotomy between the two, and leading them in a holistic climate action approach. Interesting. Just wanted to hear how it is from your perspective in the city. Was that difficult to say we do both? We have a climate mitigation and adaptation strategy. Were there people opposed to it?
We released our plan in 2014. And in fact, it was funny because we were so early that the week after we released our plan, the US EPA made an announcement that they were ready to begin advising cities on how to do adaptation plans. But we didn't get any opposition at all, and I think part of that was because the year before, 2013, Colorado had some 500-year floods. We had bad flooding in Denver, but up to the north of us in Boulder, Fort Collins, they had some horrific 500-year floods. So people were ready to talk about adaptation even then. I also think, though, it was important that when we explained it to the public, we said, this isn't a surrender. We're just trying to do both at the same time, because there's so many strategies we can do for adaptation that also work for mitigation, that we're just going to do them both at the same time. So we didn't really have any opposition at all when we came out with the plan. Other questions? Okay, well, we'll have some time again at the end for more questions. Let's go to the second area of megatrend, which is sustainability itself. And I will tell you, the first question I got when I took over as the city's first chief sustainability officer, and that you always get is, well, what do you mean by sustainability? And people were always amazed when we responded that we said we don't define it. I didn't even like the word. In this area, and I've been doing it since I was a teenager, really, in this area, we tend to use these 6-syllable words like environmentalism or sustainability, which are very off-putting and elite sounding. But that's the word that, we've been using. We didn't define it. We did explain why we were doing it. We said that we wanted to ensure that the basic resources that our economy, our quality of life depend on, that our basic resources were available and affordable to everyone, both now and in the future, which we felt was not a definition of sustainability. It was an explanation of what we were trying to do. But I do think that just as environmentalism and conservation were kind of superseded by sustainability in recent years, the sustainability sun may now be setting. And these little clouds are coming up over the horizon. One of them is called resilience, which we've already discussed a little bit in talking about adaptation. And the other is called regeneration. Now, I will tell you, I don't think that there's anything particularly new about either of those two concepts. In fact, I think they've been bouncing around in sustainability for a while. But vocabulary words mean a lot. And I think also when there's frustration about some of the things I talked about in the last section, one of the solutions people come up with is they come up with a new system, or at least something that sounds like a new system, which is resilience or regeneration. And so as professionals, it's important to begin to develop some familiarity with that language and the vocabulary, because I do think that those terms are going to move more to the fore, and sustainability may move more towards the background in the years to come. Related to that, a second mega trend is the sustainability office and the sustainability plan may disappear. It's interesting, when I interviewed for my job in Denver, the mayor asked me, what would success look like if I hired you? And I said, success would be that you would eliminate my office for the right reasons. And I didn't know it at the time, but I later found out that was the answer that got me the job. In the government, and particularly in the nonprofit world, we tend to always find reasons to make ourselves essential and that we never disappear. But really, sustainability needs to be a core business value of a company, of a government, a local, state, national. It needs to be a business value, which means not an office, because when it's a standalone office or a plan, it's something that someone else does. And our mayor didn't want that. He agreed with me. And in fact, our sustainability office did disappear after I stepped down. He basically took that program and combined it with our climate change and energy and electric vehicle programs, and created a new office that was focusing mainly on the climate change plans, because he had read the IPCC report as well. And he knew that that's where the city needed to put its effort. And by the way, they also increased the budget so much that we went from 3 people in my office to 25. So that allowed me to tell people that I was very flattered that the mayor felt he needed to hire 25 people to replace me. But the idea is there isn't a standalone sustainability office there. And we never actually did a sustainability plan in Denver. We actually took heat from our county auditor because of that, because we already had plans. You know, people say, well, you do or don't have a sustainability office or officer. Let me tell you, every city has had a sustainability officer for decades. They just don't call them the sustainability officer. They may call them the director of public works. They may call that person the director of health or whatever. It's always been there. And the standalone office, even though I was the head of one for 7 years, it made me nervous. And so what I think is going to happen is sustainability is going to become more of a business value or culture, less of a standalone office. One trend that I've been very interested in, that I've been advocating actually with some success, is for cities that are to the point where they have to come up with a new comprehensive plan. Let's roll sustainability into the comprehensive plan. So let's not have a standalone sustainability plan. Let's make it part of the city's comprehensive plan. And let's not have a standalone sustainability office, including in a corporation. Let's make it part of the core value of the government or of the business, and so that it's part of everything. Some corporations are doing this now too. They are recognizing that the fact that whenever you put sustainability off in a corner, separate, even though you're holding it up, it's like the green shiny ornament on the tree. Really, it needs to infuse everything that you're doing, and I think that's a good thing. And in the next section, we'll talk a little bit about what that means for you in terms of your careers. But so those trends were kind of already going on early this year, and then COVID came in. You can't, do a lecture these days without talking about COVID. COVID's changed everything. What's the world going to be like, and so forth and so on. But I think COVID has really, in the area of municipal sustainability, which is what I work in now, it's had 2 changes. One, it's had changes in the strategies that we can pursue or that we should pursue. And the other is it affects the resources that we have available to us. In terms of strategies, really a lot of the core strategies that we've been following in urban sustainability have to change. They are changing, and they really have to change. I wrote an article on LinkedIn way back in April of this year, in which I advocated that telecommuting needed to become the leading sustainable mobility strategy for cities. Not just one of the strategies, the leading strategy, which would be really revolutionary. We were aware of it. When we would track what's called the mode share in Denver, how many people are driving alone to work, how many people are carpooling, transit, and so forth. We were tracking telecommuting. We were aware of it, but we had no strategies for it whatsoever. Just we didn't feel it was something that we could influence. But then COVID came along, and all of a sudden, everyone's working at home or working remotely. And that has some real possibilities. In Denver, and these numbers are probably true in many cities, but in Denver, when I started out in 2012, 72% of our workforce was driving alone to work. That was how they commuted. After 6 years of effort, because they don't have the latest statistics, but we know after 6 years, we've gone from 72 to 68. Our goal for 2 years later, 2020, was 60, and we weren't going to get there. And we had already set a further out goal, 2030, of 50%. Then telecommuting happened. And all of a sudden in my article, I said, I think we just met our 2030 goal, not our 2020 goal, our 2030 goal. Because I'm pretty sure that back last spring, less than 50% of workers in Denver were driving alone to work. Telecommuting has the potential to do that. If you look at those numbers, to go from 68 now to 50 in 2030, that's 18 percentage points. So we would just have to take 18 out of the 68% of commuters who were traveling by driving themselves, if we could get that portion, which is about 1 out of 4, if we could get 1 out of 4 to switch to telecommuting, we would meet our goal with no increase in transit, no increase in cycling, none of that. We would actually meet our goal. And on top of that, of course, transit is struggling mightily. They were already having problems before, but now they're struggling even more. So that's a big switch in strategies. And of course, we run into inertia. You know, everyone's locked into the strategies that they've been doing up until now. It's difficult to pivot quickly, particularly when there's so many other distractions. But that's one pivot that I think cities really have to make right now. And it's achievable. Similarly, recycling. Recycling was already struggling before COVID. It was a failing system. It was complicated. The rules were different depending on whether you lived in this community or that community. The rules were different depending on whether you were at home or at work. The rules were different whether you lived in a single family home or a multi-unit building. It was not working out. China was closing the door on a lot of our recyclables. And then COVID hit. And, you know, recycling can be a very labor-intensive industry, and recycling plants are often a lot like food processing plants. And you all know the problems that they had. And so recycling has been hit really, really hard. And the shift is now, the big term that everyone's talking about is circularity, which is not just looking at the problem only after it hits the waste basket or after it hits the recycling bin, but looking at consumption from the very beginning. And I think that's a big switch that I'm seeing in cities. A partner company I work with in the Netherlands, Metabolic, recently produced the first sustainability plan for a major US city, Charlotte, North Carolina, based centrally on circularity rather than on climate. And I think that's a big trend. And finally, obviously, we have to start leading with equity. And I want to emphasize the word leading with equity, not just doing equity. We have to make it the leading sustainability strategy right now. But I will tell you, it can lead to unexpected results. I had a big fight with our parks department a couple of years ago when they wanted to have a special fund on the ballot to provide parkland in the downtown area of Denver because they said there's not enough of it. And I said, you know, the people who moved there knew there wasn't enough of it. And the people who buy downtown, they're rich people. They knew there wasn't enough parkland. I don't think it's fair to take a limited fund and spend it on acquiring more parkland downtown when the areas, you know, outside of downtown that are lower income don't have access to parks and other things that the people downtown did. Let's just say a lot of tension was created by that position. People thought, well, he's the green guy. He must support a fund that would buy more parkland. But when you actually apply equity, really truly understand it and apply it, it will lead you to some unexpected results. And one reason for that is that there's kind of, you know, if you know Newtonian laws of motion, for each action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. You know, so in equity, for each policy, there can be equal and opposite equity arguments. I can take individual policies and say, from an equity point of view, that's good. You know, let's say putting more trees and parkland and so forth in lower income neighborhoods. Or I can say, no, from an equity point of view, that's bad, because when you do that, you increase the property values in the neighborhood and you start a cycle that leads to gentrification and displacement. So we have to start leading with equity, but we also have to understand it. We have to understand that for many policies, you can make an argument both ways, that it will promote equity, but it will also undermine equity. And in addition, as a result of that, really, it can lead to unexpected results, to results that people who are working in sustainability may not necessarily expect. And let me pause again there, and we'll see if there's any questions about this section of my presentation.
Well, Jerry, that was definitely like, whew, a lot. I mean, I would have a lot of questions there, especially how you bring it all together, basically in a positive way, right? To say goodbye to the term sustainability, deal with the pandemic crisis impacts that we don't know yet. I mean, it might be, you know, people always thought, well, it could be over very soon, but maybe not. Maybe it's going to hang around a little longer than we thought. And then the equity, and of course also, there's equity, racial justice. That's a huge issue that's been so neglected so long. Anybody who's been working in sustainability or climate longer knows that. And this is a lot of work. And at the same time, you mentioned this with the transit part, declining funds or cities struggling to have still the money to fund programs. This sounds like a lot of challenges or opportunities for, new ideas and new solutions. It's kind of a big moment. Do you see it? You said you're going to end on a high note, so I'm going to not ruin this now. No, but I think when we listen to you, we could indeed be tempted to seeing this as a very worst case, the big storm scenario. But it's good to see that it's all there, and we have to be aware of it. I think it's very important. Yeah.
Well, let me I think I'm going to go to the final portion of this, the ending on a high note, so that we know how much time we have, because I'm watching the clock. But I will say, even in this section, to me, some of this is a real high note. I'm very excited about the prospect of switching to telecommuting as a mobility strategy. I am very excited about the potential of circularity. I think it's high time that we stop only worrying about things when they hit the wastebasket and start looking at the entire consumption cycle. And I think it's high time that we start doing things, specific actions on equity, rather than just talking about it all the time. So to a degree, there's a high note there, but in the profession itself, I think there's also some good news. Number one, in sustainability in the profession, I think there's a somewhat of a tension between certification and experience. A lot of attention being paid to what someone says you know and can do. The master's degree programs in sustainability, which I think are fascinating. The certificate programs in sustainability. The minors in sustainability. The certification programs, I talk about the LEED AP and all those LEED certifications. There's also a group called ISSP, the International Society of Sustainability Professionals. They have a certification program. But I will tell you, as an employer who has hired people in this field, speaking only for myself, what's most important to me is not what piece of paper you have, it's what you've actually done. It's whether you've actually produced a GIS map, whether you've brought a group together to do a group project that's produced something physically on the ground, whether you've conducted a meaningful census or poll or focus group, whether you've produced a website that's actually moved people. To me, those things are more important than the certification and experience. I like to see both of them, but if I have to choose, it's what you've actually done, what you have the capability of doing, and not so much what you know. As I mentioned, I'm entirely self-taught in this area. I haven't had I was running an international bird conservation program in Ohio for 6 years. I haven't had a science course since high school. So that's, to me, is good news, because you have a lot more control over what you've done, what you start to do, particularly if you're inclined towards entrepreneurship, than you have about what paper someone else is going to give you and how valuable it is. Yeah.
A question about that?
Yeah.
So, hey, this is Nat. So I really appreciated a couple things. I really appreciated what you said about basically operationalizing sustainability to sort of work your way out of a job. I think that's a huge, critical thing as we look at all these organizations that have sort of worked to not move the needle enough to have to aggressively reinvent themselves or work their way into a new realm or out of whatever, wherever they are. One thing I wanted to ask about, though, was on that note, you mentioned coming from a sort of unconventional background into this space, and you also mentioned a firm that was working on doing a climate plan for a city. How do you figure out how to balance this technical expertise, this sort of technocratic expertise and regime with sort of more of like a direct outreach equity strategy? I think that I would follow up that question with just an example from living in a Rust Belt city, where the city will say, like, we don't have money to pay people, but then they'll subcontract for an $800,000 consulting contract to, like, whether it's KPMG or HNTB or WSP or some giant consulting firm that's, you know, engineering or business consulting or whatever, when in reality there are people down the block who have a lot of the answers. They just might not have the exact language for how to solve the problem. So I think, like, how do you balance that as a member of someone who's on the inside?
You know, I think part of the problem is a lot of people are uncomfortable being out on the street and just walking the streets and seeing what's going on. It's much more comfortable to sit in a classroom and take a course, or now sitting online and taking a course and doing a test. And it's also kind of harder to be out on the street right now, but I don't think that's a permanent situation. But I really do think there is no substitute for just getting out there and walking around and looking around at your city, to experiencing your city. You cannot know a city from the inside of a car or from reading a book. You just have to go out there and look around. And I'll give you an example of how this played out in equity, a battle which, by the way, which I lost. But I was on something called the Sustainable Food Policy Council in Denver after having done, you know, the nation's first regional food system assessment plan while I was in Columbus. And this group was tormenting itself about that they didn't have diversity in the group. They didn't have enough diversity in the group. And they had every year we're having problems recruiting and so forth. And I remember one discussion where they said, you know, what we really need to do is we need to bring a trainer in here, pay a trainer. We need to bring a trainer in here to come here and teach us diversity and teach us cultural sensitivity. And I raised my hand and said, or we could walk across the street from where we meet, because right across the street from where we meet is a public housing project. Or we can just walk across the street to the public housing project and go talk to the manager who knows the residents and say, hey, do you know someone who lives here who might be able to come across the street, you know, once a month and meet with us and tell us how the food system is affecting them, or react to some of the ideas we're having about how things could get better? Could we just do that? And the group was, oh no, we can't do that until we've first had this education and the training and so forth and so on. And so personally, I think, you know, the training has value, the learning has value. You know, you can't do something until you've learned how to do it. But I don't think there's any real substitute for just getting out on the street and walking on the street and going into restaurants, maybe in neighborhoods that you're not comfortable in, which I've done, and just learning it from a street level view. Now, the other part of the good news here is, as I put on my second point here, this market for sustainability is expanding. And one of the ways to view that expansion is to stop thinking about green jobs. You know, everyone talks about green jobs. We want to have people installing solar panels, and that's great. But from the point of view of the people on the street in these neighborhoods, they don't care whether the job is green or not. They care whether they have a job, whether it's full-time, whether they have benefits, whether they have family leave and so forth. And here's the great news. Stop focusing on green jobs, start focusing on greening jobs. Because almost any workplace, almost any company can be greener in its operations, and they're willing to be. And it's not just on the East and West Coast anymore. You know, here in Denver, for example, we have DaVita. DaVita is a provider of kidney dialysis services. Now, no one thinks kidney dialysis is a green job, but they have a very conscious program of greening up everything they do, from commuting to purchasing to the cafeteria to how they handle waste and so forth. So I think the market for people who know not so much about green jobs, but for greening jobs is expanding rapidly, and that's great news. And then finally, you know, when we have change like a recession, there's a shakeout. And yes, some NGOs are going to disappear, some already have, some government offices are going to disappear, but there's going to be new ones. And what I really love, I love a lot of things about the millennial generation, but I love the spirit of entrepreneurship, risk-taking, different lifestyles, different work styles, and so forth, that generation has. I think even with all these pressures that I've discussed earlier, on balance in this profession, there's a lot of opportunities. You just need to think about the profession more broadly than perhaps you have been, and look for opportunities in companies like, you know, DaVita or Aero Electronics or places like that you might not have thought about previously. But, you know, I'll end with this story. One of the great sustainability leaders here in Denver, a woman named Brenna Simmons St. Ange, who runs the Alliance Center, which is a kind of center of conservation and sustainability in Denver. She got her start managing housekeeping at one of the big hotels in Denver. Again, no one thinks of that as a green job, cleaning up hotel rooms. But she created a green team at her hotel and looked at every aspect of the operation of that hotel. She created her own job, basically. And now that hotel, whether it's their cleaning products, their water usage, the beehives that they put up on the roof, the products they're making from the honey from the beehive and selling down in their gift shop, you know, she greened up her job. And that's really, I think, where the opportunities are. Almost any company you look at, the job may not have sustainability in the title, but you can still do it as a sustainable job. And I'm going to look here if I can find a second. Max, I'm not seeing the little thing that allows me to take back control here.
Yeah, you can stop sharing.
Oh,
yeah, here we go. Here we go.
Question.
Perfect. Well, first of all, Jerry, thank you. This was really, really interesting. And you have to tell me one day, if I ever travel again and come to Denver, which hotel this is. Sounds really exciting. So yeah, we still have a few minutes left in the hour, and urgent questions first. Okay, so Jerry, you mentioned some NGOs will go, some government entities. You mentioned public transport. That's, of course, under a lot of pressure financially. But that there's also opportunity. And I just think that has to be the case. You know, otherwise we can all just give up if this is from here on only downward. But this is really, I hope, an exciting opportunity for a turning point, hopefully, of course, for better, for, you mentioned integration of sustainability and climate in general, in planning. And in the end, you mentioned integration of the sustainability principles in private sector, in company approaches, in business strategies. Very exciting. I know a lot of people here on the call work in cities or for cities and have maybe their own experiences. I think if there are follow-up comments, feel free to also share them over email or social media on the LinkedIn group or the Facebook group if the time isn't enough. And we only have 2 minutes left in the hour. So if people want to interject, they can do so now. Jerry, just coming back to you and your new company, you said it's improving, it's warming up. You said that in the beginning. Mm-hmm. So there's a reason for hope. Is it, you know, are we at the darkest point of the night, or is it already sunrise?
No one knows. we don't know, but I've been impressed by how well the economy has carried on despite everything. So I'm going to keep doing this until I retire, and I'm lucky because I'm at the latter part of my career. I can afford to do this without much income. But I do think even for the younger people who are on this, the opportunities are really great. I did see a chat question. Someone said, does Denver have a LEED requirement for buildings? Denver government for its own buildings does require that every new construction, every major remodel has to seek LEED Platinum and achieve at least gold. We don't have a requirement for buildings in the private sector, although they were and maybe now have created a stretch code beyond the current energy code that will at least be available. We also have a green building policy that requires buildings every certain number of years to kind of self-audit and improve their performance up to the standards of our green building policy. So to extent we do, I do think the trend here, starting in Berkeley, which recently passed a law that said no new construction can have a gas pipeline. It's got to be all electric. I think that's the trend of the future in city buildings. I've been reviewing a lot of city climate plans right now and been preparing one for Fort Collins. That's going to be a major trend of the next 10 years to figure out a way to get all of our buildings off of natural gas.
Oh yeah, and there's going to be a lot of controversy with people trying to still sell natural gas, of course. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Jerry. It's the end of our hour. Very unfortunate that time has run out already, but again, we'll meet again online. We don't know yet if it's on the third Thursday again, so we'll see about that. The doodle will close today if you still want to vote on that, and also we'll probably meet on a different platform then, so don't just click on the same link again on the third Thursday. I'll send you updates. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jerry, for sharing this with us. I think this gives hope to those of us who are looking for some inspiration and some positive outlook, also for some comprehensive understanding of where we are in the situation. Because even if you're not looking for a new employment, new job, or a new position, getting a good grasp of where we are in terms of, you said mega trends, but then you also reacted to the current situation, and you have these very detailed insights into what's happening in cities. And that really gives you a very good snapshot of, there's somebody who says we're over time. Okay, good, great. Thank you so much for sharing this with us, Jerry. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you for your questions and your patience. And then see you again in about a month.
Yeah, and you can contact me if you have later questions through my website, which is Westurb, WESTURB, westurb.com.